Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the Vice President and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center here. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the Council for what I'm certain will be a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation on the state of play in Syria, in Iraq, in the broader region, and whether the threat of ISIS, or whatever I should call it today, could forge a coalition among states in certain ways that rarely see eye to eye, and we really want to push this dimension of the overall question. I'm particularly pleased to welcome to the Atlantic Council His Excellency Ambassador Lukman Faily. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for coming. One of the most effective Twitter ambassadors I've ever seen, by the way. Iraq is really at a breaking point. As many of you know, there are daily headlines illustrating the ongoing conflict and battles. Syria continues in its conflict, and ISIS certainly appears to be making some significant gains in various ways. And despite efforts for a more inclusive government, which many see as the key to helping to stabilize the country, it does not look like it's heading in that direction. It looks increasingly like a more intensive sectarian war. ISIS continues to challenge Iraqi forces and have been successful in taking key territory, including oil fields, including the city of Mosul, as many of you know. And there's an ongoing battle for parts of Tikrit almost as we speak. So the Iraqi government no longer controls all of its territory, and the conflict is certainly taking on new dimensions, with the Kurdish government in the north announcing a referendum to pursue independence, and it's deployed its own forces to secure 2 large oil fields in Kirkuk and in Bai Hassan. The startling advances of ISIS across Iraq have prompted many regional and global players to reassess their policies in the Middle East. So this is a big time of flux among the outside players as well, and that's why we wanted to have this very important discussion. Certainly the United States, key Gulf states, Iran and Syria share certain selected interests in defeating ISIS and in the overall stability of Iraq, but it's quite clear, too, that this commonality will have very, very significant limits, and we'll see if it can even enable selected collaboration on very discrete tasks associated with this great challenge. We've heard U.S. and Iranian officials recently signaling a guarded willingness to cooperate to avoid an intensification and expansion of this conflict in Iraq. And we've seen, even within the past 2 weeks, Iran's deputy foreign minister beginning a tour of the Gulf to discuss possible solutions for the crisis in Iraq. But here, in particular, we look at ISIS as endemic, as indicative of a more endemic challenge, and that's the continuing rise in power of a broad range of non-state actors in key regions across the world, and we're seeing the headlines this morning in eastern Ukraine as yet another example of this trend. And so the trend really bears out this factor of individual empowerment that the National Intelligence Council's Global Trends report highlighted a couple of years ago, and which is certainly a central focus of my center's own strategic foresight initiative. The fact that a group in a remote part of the world is able to deny sovereignty to 2 nation states and claim part of each as its own with no immediate challenge is but one very, very concerning development, but there will be a range of others that will surprise all of us, I think, equally over the next several years. Now, back to the specific issue, a coalition among the countries I've talked about obviously presents enormous political, economic, diplomatic, and other challenges. And so we're here today to discuss the viability of potential partnerships and what these partnerships might mean for global issues, for regional security, and for geopolitics. This event builds on a lot of work underway at the Hariri Center and at the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council, and it's part of a larger effort that we're undertaking to understand the rise of non-state actors, the associated challenges and threats, in some cases the opportunities, but in all cases the impact on the regional order as well as the global order. So I'd like to stop talking now and introduce Ambassador Faily, but before I do, Please note that this is on the record. We're tweeting heavily already. The hashtag is AC Iraq, and the key account here that's tweeting is AC Scowcroft, the Scowcroft Center Twitter account. Ambassador Faily, from June 2010 until May of 2013, was Iraq's ambassador to Japan. Before this assignment, he served as an ambassador at the Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has extensive experience in the information technology sector. Even just in our small meeting, I got a lot of hints from him about managing my email inbox and a number of other things that make me want to hire him as a consultant for our information technology. But he has vast experience in that sector, which will obviously prove helpful in a number of ways for his duties here. He previously held senior management positions in major American companies and a broad range of other accomplishments. But I think with that, I will just thank him once again for coming, and I look forward to your remarks.
So I'll let you guess my age now. So, first of all, good morning, everybody. Your Excellencies, Barry, thank you for the opportunity. And I think it's my first event at the Atlantic Council. I've been on the other side, so it's interesting to see the work, vast of work, which Hariri and the Scowcroft Center have done. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity today. I also would like to thank you for focusing on this important issue. Today I will use the acronym of, I will use ISIL, if you don't mind, that's my preferred name for it. Before I go any further, I want to thank the American people for the great sacrifices that you have made to help the Iraqi people to free ourselves from the brutal tyrant Saddam and to put us on the path of democracy. Our democratic path have often been rocky and uphill, but we have persevered. The Iraqi nation is now at a difficult and dangerous point as we confront a terrorism that is transnational in nature. I cannot understate the gravity of the current situation. Iraq faces an existential threat, the likes of which we and our neighbors in the region have not seen before. We are grateful that the United States did not abandon the Iraqi people during the darkest days of the war. And we are hopeful that you will not abandon us now, as we struggle against the very same forces of violent extremists that now have so much with so ambitious goals in their sight, in which they extend beyond the Middle East and onto the rest of the world. As we meet this morning, the Iraqi people are under direct attacks by an unholy alliance of al-Qaeda-inspired jihadists and die-hard Saddam loyalists. Contrary to what some would have you believe, this is not a Sunni rebellion against a Shia government. This is an all-out insurgency led by ISIL extremists who are committed to creating a terrorist safe haven in the heart of the Middle East that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea on the Syrian side to the most eastern Iraqi province of Diyala. This much is clear. ISIL targets everybody and anybody, whether Muslims or Christians, Sunni imams or moderate Shia, who do not swear allegiance to their fanatics and backward views. With the recent establishment of self-proclaimed Khalifa or Khilafah in Syria and Iraq, ISIL has, in effect, declared that its objective is to fight people everywhere, religiously, regionally, globally, and regionally. The current crisis can only be quelled with a comprehensive strategy that includes military action and also political, economical, humanitarian, and diplomatic effort by all parties concerned. ISIL is a common enemy of the Iraqi people, our neighbors, the United States, and certainly United States allies. And we must make a common effort to defeat them. This is a dangerous new development in the Middle East that requires a new doctrine to combat terrorism. On the military front, with its indiscriminate destructiveness, ISIL is sowing the seeds of its own eventual defeat. We know that from experience. However, until then, ethnic cleansings and systematic destructions of unique cultures and heritages will suffer irreversibly. In occupied Mosul, ISIL has destroyed Shia mosques, Sunni shrines, and occupied Christian cathedrals. Just last week, they issued an ultimatum to Christian residents, ordering them to convert to ISIL deviant versions of Islam or pay what they call the jihad tax. If they do not comply, the ultimatum declared, then they would literally face the sword. Along with Iraqi Christian minorities, thousands of other minorities communities have been forced to flee their homes, often leaving all their belongings behind. A recent report by Human Rights Watch said ISIL has systematically killed and tortured Chaldeo-Ashurian Christians, Shia, Shabaks, Turkmens, and Yazidis by labeling them, for example, as crusaders, heretics, or devil worshippers. Notwithstanding major setbacks on the military front, Iraqi security forces have been re-energized, in part by the country's most senior religious leader, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who issued a fatwa urging able-bodied Iraqis to join the Iraqi security forces and defend their homeland. Thousands upon thousands of Iraqis, young and old, Shia and Sunnis, are answering the call to fight back against ISIL. Such a fatwa has not been made by any Grand Ayatollah since the early 1920s. Grand Ayatollah Sistani rarely speaks out about government issues, and when he does, he is a force of national unity for democracy and for rule of law. After the attack on the al-Askari mosque back in 2006 in Samarra, he spoke out for unity among Shia and Sunni. Now he's working with other religious leaders to quell the sectarian tension and strengthen the ties between the Sunnis and Shia communities everywhere in Iraq, with Arabs and Kurds, Turkmens, during this critical time we're all facing. This is truly the time to remind all Iraqis that our enemy is not those who worship in different ways. Our enemy is those who are attacking us all. Because ISIL is targeting all Iraqis, their beliefs, their culture, and their physical existence, whether they are Sunni, Shia, Kurds, or any of our diverse nations, or any of our unique cultures and groups, we are seeking to unite all Iraqis against these extremists and fanatics. Even in times of crisis, the democratic process does not proceed as rapidly as tyrants or terrorists, but ultimately, representative government and the rule of law do offer the greatest opportunities for ensuring that everyone has a voice and no one feels excluded. Following the free April elections, in which approximately 60% of the people of Iraq participated, the process of forming a new government is moving forward. This process is underway in line with constitutional framework and must not be undermined. The election of the Speaker of Parliament and his two deputies last week was a significant breakthrough and showed that Iraqi political leaders can put their differences behind them and come together for the sake of our country unity during this pivotal time. On Wednesday, July 23rd, the Iraqi Council of Representatives is expected to elect a new president, who is likely to be a Kurd. There is every possibility that a new government will be formed within the stipulated constitutional timeline. Just to remind you all, in recent history, this process took 9 months and 6 months. This time, we are talking about only 6 weeks. The terrible violence has created not only a security and a political crisis, but also a humanitarian crisis. While ISIL glories in murder and mayhem, the Iraqi people are trying to ease the suffering of those who have found themselves in the terrorist lines of fire. Since last month crisis alone, some 650,000 people have been forced to flee their homes in Mosul. In total, there are an estimated 1.2 million displaced Iraqis across the country. 1.2. On the economic front, the extremists understand that what they are doing, using violence to vandalize what had been one of the world's fastest growing economy. The terrorists understand that broadly shared economical opportunities denies them support, and that increasing joblessness and hopelessness offer them a pool of potential recruits. If ISIL succeeds in expanding the current conflict to the southern provinces, the potential impact on the international oil markets will be disastrous. Before the current conflict, our oil production had increased by 50% since 2005. We were expected to emerge as the world's second largest energy exporter by 2030. This had been a critical factor in keeping global economy markets stable, despite increased sanctions on Iran. This is one more reason why the world community has a stake in defeating ISIL and in securing a stable and prosperous Iraq. Make no mistake, the current conflict in Iraq is not only a threat to Iraq alone. ISIL and the virulent and violent transnational terrorism that it represents, it threatens the entire region, indeed the entire world. Here, the United States also has a stake in turning the tide against the transnational terrorist. We welcome President Obama's decision to send US counterterrorism advisors to Iraq and to support our armed forces. However, speaking as a friend and an admirer of the United States, there seems to me to be an additional option you should consider at this difficult but urgent moment. First, the current US-Iraqi counterterrorism coordination should be expanded to include airstrikes. That would serve to protect Iraqi borders against the further influx of terrorists from Syria. Second, you should offer air support targeting terrorist camps and supply convoys in the remote areas. And third, in order to enable us to effectively conduct counterterrorism operations in urban areas that have been occupied by ISIL terrorists, we need a precision US airstrikes. The effort I've just outlined are not new military concepts for the United States or for Iraq. Working together before, we implemented a similar strategy that defeats al-Qaeda back in 2005 onward. During these difficult days, Iraq has chosen the United States as its preferred strategic partner. Our relationship is governed by the Strategic Framework Agreement, which we don't have with any other country. Our government has purchased more than $10 billion worth of necessary military equipment from the United States, and we are planning to buy billions more, and we are doing this with our own funds. Still, there are some confusions about American intentions. There are some in Iraq who are skeptical about the administration's response to the crisis in Iraq. The administration wants us to believe that they are providing limited support to help now, to us now, and are using the prospect of US air support and other military assistance to encourage political reforms in Baghdad. However, I have to tell you that not everyone in Baghdad believes this. We have skeptics who argue that this is really a conscious US strategy for doing very little. that Washington's intention is to create preconditions that we probably cannot satisfy, and then move the goalpost, if necessary, to ensure that we do not satisfy them. Such suspicions are highly corrosive to Americans' relations with Iraq and its people. If Iraqis do not believe that meaningful US assistance is forthcoming, then they will not have enough incentives to adopt and stand by the political reforms that the United States is urging us. The US administration needs to refute these suspicions by making clear that the United States will in fact give the democratically elected government of Iraq air support and other essential military assistance, what I might call a game changers, that can turn the tide against ISIL. If Iraq political leaders make significant headway in formation of the new government. In a nutshell, clarity is crucial. Now more than ever, the United States needs to be careful not to send mixed signals about its intentions. These mixed signals will create a vacuum that will be filled by others. The situation on the ground is developing rapidly. It threatens the territorial integrity of Iraq, with potential regional implications. Much has been said about the regional effects of the spillover of the violence from Syria, but a spillover from Iraq to its neighbors in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and elsewhere would have unfathomable consequences that do not bear thinking about. Let us all deal with the ISIL evil now, before no amount of catch-up by the US and its allies can address the ISIL trail of devastation and chaos. Time is not on our side, nor it's on our neighbors or United States sides. Further delay benefits only the terrorist. But decisive actions against common threats will serve our common interest in a stable and secure Iraq, striving to build an inclusive democracy after decades of despotism and divisiveness. The United States and Iraq are forever tied together because of our lost lives and treasures expended by both of our countries over the last decade in our common fight against terrorism and extremism. Now that the Iraqi political process is progressing toward a solution, we hope our American allies will move forward with a robust security assistance package during our time of needs. Together, we can defeat the transnational terrorism who are our common enemy and build a secure and stable Iraq, which is our common goal. Thank you, America, for everything that you have done together and everything that we will do together. If we act decisively at this crucial moment, then years from now, our children and grandchildren will read about tyranny and terrorism in their history books, and peace and prosperity in their daily newspapers. This is our goal, and I know it is yours as well. Let me thank the Atlantic Council again for giving me the opportunity today. Thank you again. Where do you want me to sit?
I think your name is right there. Well, thanks, Mr. Ambassador, for some really not just stark, but also sort of heartfelt remarks. They are very much appreciated, and they raise a lot of important issues, which we will be addressing right away. Let me briefly introduce my other three panelists. You have their biographies, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, to the ambassador's immediate left, Michael Singh. He is currently the managing director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He previously was a White House official from 2005 to 2008, where he spent a lot of his time and responsibilities coordinating U.S. policy toward the region stretching from Morocco to Iran, with a particular emphasis on Iran's nuclear and regional activities, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Syria, security cooperation in the broader Middle East, and other minor duties such as those. That was clearly a joke in light of what's going on today. To his left, we have Senior Fellow at the Rafik Hariri Center here, Fred Hoff. He was appointed to be Special Advisor for Transition in Syria by President Obama on March 28, 2012. He previously was the Special Coordinator for Regional Affairs in the U.S. Department of State's Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace and has decades of experience in the region. And if you don't follow Fred Hoff's views on Syria, then you're not really following Syria, in my opinion. And then at the end of the panel, but not the least important at all, is Bilal Saab, who's a Senior Fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center. Here, he covers a range of issues regarding the Middle East with a particular focus on defense, policy, posture, and industrial-based issues in the Arabian Gulf. Bilal has more than 12 years of research analysis and management experience in Middle East affairs. Fuller bios are available in the handout. And with that, I'd like to turn to Michael Singh for his views on the issues that we've been broaching.
Great, thank you, Barry. First, let me say that it's a real honor to be here at the Atlantic Council. I've got tremendous admiration for what Fred and Damon and Barry have built here. And I consider myself a friend of the Atlantic Council. It's also an honor to be on the panel with the ambassador and with Fred and Bilal, who are certainly among the sort of most respected analysts of these issues in Washington. And I'll say that I have my phone here. I'm not live tweeting my own comments. I have my notes on my phone, so excuse me. I'm just going to try to speak very briefly about the U.S. and Iran in Iraq and prospects for cooperation, because it's been a hot topic as this crisis has unfolded. And one thing that you will hear a lot about the U.S. and Iran and Iraq is that we have the same interests, or we have overlapping interests in Iraq. I don't think this is correct, and I'm going to explain why. First and foremost, most fundamentally, I think there's confusion over what is an interest. What's the difference between an interest and a position? I think that we and Iran, the United States and Iran, have had similar positions on ISIS, and I'm going to say ISIS only because it's easier for me to say. We've had similar positions. We're both opposed to ISIS. But does that flow from a commonality of interests? I would say no. And I want to first use an example to illustrate how I see the difference between positions and interests. And it will have nothing to do with the Middle East. It's about NAFTA. Those of you who have taken sort of negotiation 101 will probably recognize this example. NAFTA was opposed. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. Was opposed by both labor unions and environmental groups. Why? They had the same position. They were against it. Why was each against it? Certainly not for the same reason. Environmentalists, obviously for environmental concerns, labor unions because of their own certain concerns. This is the difference between an interest and a position. And I think we can see a similar dichotomy between the U.S. and Iran and Iraq. When we talk about the supposed overlapping interests that the U.S. and Iran have in Iraq, people will say, well, you know, Iran is opposed to Sunni extremist groups. I'm not sure that this is really right, that this is really an interest of Iran's per se. Why do I say that? Well, because we've seen plenty of support going from Iran to Sunni extremist groups in the past, including from time to time in Iraq itself. But the most sort of telling examples of this would be Iranian support for Hamas. The conflict right now in Gaza, for example, is made possible by the fact that Iran ships weapons to Hamas as well as to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, both of which are Sunni extremist groups. We've also seen Iranian support for Sunni extremist groups in places like Lebanon, in Syria, as well as even in a more limited way, for al-Qaeda and for the Taliban. Which you'd think would be enemies of Iran and are enemies of Iran in a sense. But Iran has found it in its interests to provide limited amounts of support to those groups from time to time. When it comes to this issue for the United States, opposing ISIS is about many things, but one thing it's about is about counterterrorism, our general opposition to terrorism as a tool, as a tactic, and to those groups who use that tool. And there's obviously a lot of reasons for that. I don't see that same interest flowing out of Iran. One other reason that the United States opposes ISIS is because we support the sovereignty and stability of Iraq. This is the other oft-cited common interest between the U.S. and Iran and Iraq, the stability of Iraq. Well, again, ask yourself, is stability Iran's top interest in Iraq? And remember that countries have hierarchies of interests. I don't think that we have seen Iran behave in a way that suggests that the stability of Iraq is Iran's top interest or even necessarily one of its top interests. Certainly when the United States was involved in Iraq and trying to help Iraqis to build a stable, sovereign democracy, Iran was completely unhelpful to that task. Iran was, in fact, the chief agent for promoting instability in Iraq in an effort to, I think, drive U.S. forces out of Iraq, which was an interest of Iran's which trumped, I would say, any concerns about the stability of Iraq. Even when it became clear that the United States was withdrawing its forces from Iraq after President Obama was elected, what did we see from Iran? Not a diminution of their support for extremists and militants, but an increase in it. As U.S. troops were leaving, we saw actually an increase in Iranian support for those extremist groups. For what reason, you'll have to ask the Iranians, but perhaps to ensure that U.S. forces would in fact leave. And certainly there have been other times in the Iran-Iraq history where the stability of Iraq was certainly not Iran's foremost concern. I think what we've seen instead from Tehran is that what they most want to see in Iraq is a government which is friendly or disposed towards Iran, whatever that happens to mean. I don't think they have any particular interest, certainly, in democracy or in pluralism or in all the things that we have talked about and that the ambassador talked about wanting to see in Iraq. The American approach is very different. We have, I think, a genuine interest in seeing democracy in Iraq, in seeing pluralism, in seeing not the domination of one sect or group over another, but to see those groups come together in a multi-party democracy. Again, I don't think that that end state is necessarily what Iran has in mind. You know, just to sort of continue on this point a bit, but not to delve too much into this topic because my co-panelists will do that. Some might sort of raise a question of, well, what about Gulf interests? What about Gulf interests in Iraq, and how do they sort of play into this? Bilal is going to talk at greater length about this. But let me say as well that I don't see a perfect alignment by any means between American and Gulf interests in Iraq. The United States has been frustrated in the past by the refusal of Gulf states to really embrace Iraq over the past decade or more as a sort of fellow Arab democracy or to help Iraq on the path towards democracy. At the same time, though, I think we see a fundamentally different approach from Gulf governments than we have seen from Iran, because the Gulf governments have been willing to support the overall regional security architecture which the United States has undergirded, because they have, I think, believed that that U.S.-led security architecture has been in their interest and has been good for the region. This is one of, I think, the big dangers of the U.S. retreating and no longer supporting that security architecture, is that you see then those interests, those disparate interests of each country playing out in different and more dangerous and more destabilizing ways. And I think that's one thing the United States needs to keep in mind, is that once we retreat, other things will try to fill that vacuum, which aren't, in any case, in our interests. Just again, on the topic of U.S.-Iran cooperation, even if you sort of posited that, well, maybe I'm wrong and maybe there are these common interests, would we still want to see U.S.-Iran cooperation? I think the answer is no. First, let's think about the efficacy of Iranian involvement in Iraq. It's not clear from Iran's experience in Syria, which I believe Ambassador Hoff will address at greater length, that Iran, in fact, has the ability to defeat a group like ISIS in Iraq in a way that stabilizes the country. They certainly haven't been able to do so in Syria. In Syria, you see that the Assad government has managed to avoid collapse, has managed to avoid being overthrown, which perhaps is in defiance of expectations, given that we've heard for a long time now that its collapse is inevitable. But it hasn't been able to recapture its own territory or extend its authority over all of Syria, which is what we want to see the government in Baghdad do, certainly. I'd say if we saw the same outcome in Iraq that we've seen in Syria, where Iran's been very involved, we'd consider that quite a failure an abysmal failure, in fact, of U.S. policy, and I don't think Iraq would welcome it either. The tactics that Iran would pursue in Iraq would, I think, also be similar to what they have done in Syria. And again, that's not something we'd like to see in Iraq. More involvement, for example, by Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies. The activation and arming and funding of Shia militias, as opposed to national institutions like the Iraqi security forces, as flawed as they may be. In Syria, we've seen Assad's forces, with Iranian help, wage war against civilians. And that's certainly not something we want to see inside Iraq. You'd also, I think, see as fallout from U.S.-Iran cooperation in Iraq a lot of unhappiness amongst U.S. partners in the Gulf. And I know Bilal will talk more about that. But we're already facing very skeptical allies in the Gulf. And I think this would only deepen that skepticism and complicate a lot of other policy issues for the United States. And then just finally on this, why I think that U.S.-Iran cooperation in Iraq would be a negative thing. There's a moral dimension to this issue. There is a moral complication to cooperating with a force like Iran's Revolutionary Guards, which are the Iranian sort of force which has responsibility in the Iranian system for Iraq. This is a group which is not sponsored, not designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, but has been designated by the Treasury Department as supporting terrorism. We've designated Iran as a state sponsor of terror. And remember, this is a group which has been responsible for a tremendous number of deaths of American servicemen in Iraq and terrorist acts around the world. And it's simply not, I think, in the United States' nature to cooperate with such a group, but even if it's in pursuit of common goals. I'm going to essentially wrap it up there and simply say I don't think that looking to Iran will give us any answers in Iraq. I think we need to, frankly, look forward in Iraq. We obviously have a long history in Iraq. It's a controversial history in our country. But I think that if we're going to help Iraq to stabilize, and we're going to help Iraq along the path that we'd like to see Iraq take, that I think Iraqis would like to see, then we need a forward-looking policy. We can't be consumed, I think, in the debates of the past, in the debates of, well, who's responsible for getting us here. We have to look forward and have a forward-looking policy. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And I might ask you a quick question, which I'll do with each of the panelists, and then we'll go on to Ambassador Hoff and Bilal Saab. I think you presented a very compelling case for why U.S.-Iranian cooperation is not necessarily desirable and wouldn't be productive for a number of reasons. But I wonder if things proceed in the direction that Ambassador Faily discussed, and indeed if we think this is going to go on for quite a while, even if it extends roughly 4 months and there is a U.S.-Iranian deal, for example, on the nuclear, or a P5+1 deal on the nuclear program. I mean, what happens if U.S. forces and Iranian forces are on the same battlefield looking for the same ends? I mean, so I would understand, and I certainly agree with almost all of your points on why we shouldn't plan such cooperation. But we could very well end up being tactically on the same space. Or should the U.S. make it a condition, and we're building a few hypotheticals here, but should the U.S. make a condition of their active military involvement that there wouldn't be any engagement on the same side with Iranian forces in Iraq?
Well, I think that it's obviously a hypothetical scenario, but it's an important one because if we do provide more assistance to Iraq, which I think we should, frankly, and I think that should be sooner rather than later in coming, we could find ourselves sort of playing in the same theater as the Iranians. Look, I think that my concern is a different concern, that in fact, for Iran, keeping the United States out of Iraq, keeping the United States from any kind of re-engagement militarily in Iraq, will be an interest which trumps their interest in defeating ISIS or stabilizing Iraq, as it were. And we'll find ourselves more at odds with, once again, with the Revolutionary Guards in Iraq. I think that we should try to prevent that by sending messages through the channels that we have to Iran about what our intentions are, what we're trying to do, and what consequences Iran could expect if they find themselves running afoul of that. I don't think that requires sort of tactical battlefield cooperation or that sort of thing, in part because Iran operates fundamentally differently than the United States does, and I don't think that there'd be any sort of natural overlap between those two things.
Okay, thanks very much. Ambassador Hoff, could you let us, give us your latest insights on how Syria plays into this and your broader thoughts on the entire situation?
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Perhaps it would be useful if I just did sort of an overview of the prospects of some kind of practical cooperation between the United States and the Assad regime with respect to the ISIS threat in Syria, and I too will use ISIS as the word. This issue has come into considerable prominence recently as a result of an op-ed that appeared in the Washington Post, written by three very, very prominent, very accomplished Americans, who implied that the United States should, in fact, seek ways to cooperate with the Assad regime to confront what they described as the greater evil of ISIS. The specific point made by this trio of former distinguished diplomats was that it makes no sense for the United States to confront the Assad regime and ISIS simultaneously. Now, the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, at least until now, have taken a different position entirely. They have considered Bashar al-Assad to be part of the problem in the ISIS context, and certainly not part of the solution. My personal view is that the President and the Secretary of State are correct on this. Now, this is not just a matter of the Assad regime having spent the better part of a decade ferrying al-Qaeda type personnel into Iraq to create mayhem. It's not just a matter of the regime having emptied its prisons of violent Islamist extremists just as the Syrian uprising was beginning. And it's not just a matter of the regime's sectarian program of mass homicide, drawing foreign fighters into Syria. One can, if one wishes, simply dismiss all of this as ancient history and say it's no longer relevant given the current threat. The salient operational fact of the matter, however, is that the regime and ISIS in Syria, with the exception of some recent clashes around some oil fields, are focusing their military efforts almost 100% not against one another, but against a target they have in common, a target they wish to eliminate, that being the nationalist opposition to the Assad regime in Syria. This opposition is therefore forced to fight and defend on two fronts, against the regime and against ISIS. What the work with Assad crowd seems to be implying, therefore, is the following. Let this nationalist opposition die. Starve it of support so as to hasten what they believe to be the inevitable conflict between the regime and ISIS. Now, would such a course of action serve American interests? In my view, the answer is no. Set aside the scandalous and humiliating spectacle of working with a regime on which the United States has facilitated the accumulation of literally tons of archival material that will eventually form the basis for international prosecutions having to do with massive war crimes and crimes against humanity. Set aside the betrayal of those Syrians who have sacrificed a great deal in the expectation of some kind of meaningful assistance from the United States and its allies. Set aside the sacrifice of credibility and reputation that's being asked of the President of the United States here. Set all of that aside, what exactly would it mean to work with the Assad regime in a practical sense? Is there a role here for the American taxpayer to play? Iran and Russia have secured the Assad regime in Western Syria. If the Assad regime elects at some point to fight ISIS in Syria, surely Iran and Russia can be prime candidates to bear that burden. Now look, in World War II, the United States did indeed collaborate with a mass murderer to defeat Hitler. But no one questioned the sacrifice of the Soviet peoples in fighting and defeating the greater threat posed by Nazi Germany. If Bashar al-Assad decides at some point to confront ISIS, I think we can bet on one thing. He will seek a free ride. Already, the casualties his forces have suffered in this conflict in Syria have caused a great deal of resentment in certain parts of the country. If either by commission or omission, we cause the nationalist opposition to lose militarily, in my view, we will still have no dog in the hunt in an Assad-ISIS confrontation. My sense is that both sides, the regime and ISIS, will, for their own reasons, try to avoid an all-out showdown. ISIS will want to consolidate its barbaric governance of Syrian populated areas under its control. And Iran, which is the one party most responsible for the survival of the Assad regime, Iran is quite content to have the Assad regime firmly in the saddle in western Syria, where it can be of use to Iran in the context of Hezbollah. Now, clashes will likely take place, and ultimately, there may be a showdown between the Assad regime and the monstrosity it has helped to create. Our best course is to move now, in my view, with dispatch to help nationalist fighters inside Syria now and to build a large and powerful Syrian stabilization force outside of the country. I just conclude by saying that to work with the Assad regime is not merely to work with the devil. It's to work with the devil who on a good day, will meet you 10% of the way before trying to walk back on that 10%. Ask Russia, ask Iran. If this comes down to Assad versus ISIS in Syria, in my view, it's their problem. If we, the United States, judge that an ISIS presence in Syria or Iraq constitutes a threat to the American homeland, we can address that threat, in my view, without the costly and ultimately ineffective assistance of the Assad regime. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Let me ask you to just clarify your your large and powerful Syrian stabilization force, number one, and then number two, what if the U.S. took the recommendation of Ambassador Faily here and played a military role in Iraq? How would that affect what you're talking about in Syria and what you're recommending for Syria?
Yeah. I'm hoping now that the administration has made a decision to go to Congress with at least an initial request for $500 million to assist the armed opposition. I'm hoping that what the administration has in mind is an effort that would go along two lines. First, obviously, the necessity of getting arms, equipment, money into Syrian nationalist forces currently carrying the fight against both the regime and ISIS on two fronts. But beyond that, It seems to me that there really needs to be, over time, this is something obviously that cannot be put together in 20 minutes, figuratively speaking, but there needs to be created outside of Syria, in places like Jordan, Turkey, elsewhere, a large, powerful stabilization force consisting of Syrians, led by Syrians capable ultimately of entering the country and restoring law and order everywhere. Perhaps in cooperation with some existing forces on the ground, perhaps not. This clearly has to be a force that would be peace enforcement in nature with shoot-to-kill capability. And your second point?
Well, if the U.S. does take action in Iraq,
look, I think,
what would you advise regarding Syria?
I think the United States has a bit of a dilemma right now in Iraq. There are some attractive targets, some attractive ISIS targets in Iraq. I imagine that a good deal of target acquisition has been taking place. It's a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma for the United States right now. If we were to engage those targets effectively in Iraq, what effect would this actually have on the formation of a broad, representative Iraqi government? Would it encourage that evolution, or would it stop it in its tracks? I think clearly there are arguments to be made on both sides here, but it's a real issue. One conceivable way for the United States to avoid this dilemma might be to engage ISIS targets in Syria, where that engagement could obviously, basically hitting ISIS rear areas in Syria, where that engagement could have a positive effect on the tactical situation in Iraq, without necessarily getting directly into this chicken and egg dilemma. It would also have conceivably very positive impacts for Syrian nationalist fighters. Getting arms, equipment into these folks is not the easiest logistical operation in the world, and yet time is of the essence. If the United States chooses to engage ISIS militarily in the near future, what I'm suggesting is that Syria may be a more appropriate place to do it.
Thanks, Fred. Bilal, you've been very patient. Please weigh in on these issues.
Thanks, Barry. I like those note cards. The one Arab Gulf country I think that has the biggest stake in what happens in Iraq and whose strategic interests are affected the most by what happens in Iraq is Saudi Arabia. So I'll focus my remark on Saudi Arabia, but I'm happy to talk about the other Gulf countries during the Q&A. Here's my bottom line, and I'll read it before I forget it. Iran and Saudi Arabia are really struggling to determine the best course of action in Iraq today. I think what they're engaged in today is a very delicate balancing act in Iraq. Let me start with Iran. The Iranian rhetoric has been pretty strong on Iraq, but I think that the response has been pretty limited. So there's kind of a disconnect between the two. Here's ISIS threatening to destroy holy Shiite shrines in Iraq, and you would expect that the Iranians would send hundreds, if not thousands, of their own troops and militias to Iraq, possibly even Hezbollah, since they've done a pretty good job in Syria. But none of that has happened. What Iran has done instead is send in a handful of old Soviet-style Su-25s to help the Iraqi army. They pretty much shut down a website that was recruiting Iranian volunteers to go fight in Iraq alongside co-religionists in Iraq. It's kind of surprising. And it's fair to say that the response has been pretty reserved, so I wonder why. They could do much, much more than that to protect their strategic interest in Iraq. I think it's fairly simple. I think the Iranian leadership knows that there will be very dire consequences should they act more forcefully in Iraq. military losses, a war of attrition, further alienation of Saudi Arabia, and a more intense rivalry with Saudi Arabia that the Iranians might not need right now. They're also talking to Washington, and that's another reason. There's something brewing in the US-Iran relationship, and the Iranian leadership is not hating it, and they don't really want to mess it up by going hard after ISIS in Iraq and putting Washington in a difficult position with regard to its partners also. Some Iranian lawmakers will object to the idea of cooperating with Washington. But the key people who matter in Tehran, we haven't really heard much about what Khamenei is saying, but I know that Rouhani and the former president Rafsanjani have no problem talking to and cooperating with Washington in Iraq. Let me turn over to Saudi Arabia, which really is a fascinating story. I'm a little bit puzzled by Saudi policy and thinking in Iraq and across the Middle East. For those of you who think that Riyadh is after ISIS, really don't understand what ISIS is or don't understand the threat that groups like ISIS pose to the Saudi kingdom. Let me refresh your memory, and I won't go very far back in Saudi history. After the fall of Kandahar in 2002, US intelligence agencies and the Saudi authorities were surprised by the depth and the spread of the AQ infrastructure in the kingdom. That was an ugly surprise because in 2003, 2004, a little bit after the US invasion of Iraq, there was a massive insurgency led by someone you probably remember, Osama bin Laden. That was one of his key goals, basically, the Third Front. It was a battle of all stakes, taking over Mecca and overthrowing the Saudi monarchy, which obviously he thought was an infidel and corrupt monarchy. This was not easy to crush. It was a pretty major uprising. It took a lot of assistance from Washington, basically, to crush it. And I'm not really talking about gun battles in remote areas. This was happening across the country. And I studied that period very closely with my former colleague, Bruce Rydell. Mecca, Jeddah, Ta'if, some pretty major cities in Saudi Arabia. The country was on fire. And it took a long time to crush the uprising because it was very well organized and it was pretty much widespread. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to see that happen again. Now, what's his name? Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is not Osama bin Laden. I know that. And the extent of ISIS's virtual presence in the kingdom is not exactly what AQ had in the early 2000s. I know that too. But the concern here is not really ISIS for Saudi Arabia. It is the rise of Sunni militancy and radicalization across the region, and what might happen inside the Saudi kingdom as a result of that. Saudi Arabia sees opportunity in what ISIS is doing in Iraq. Is it concerned? Yes. But it sees opportunity. Opportunity to weaken Iran in Iraq and to strengthen its bargaining hand vis-a-vis the Iranians. Why would Saudi Arabia give it up today? That's pretty much all they got in Iraq today. It's a highly risky approach, but that's the only strategy they have in Iraq. David Ignatius got it partially right as far as the Sunni tribes, which I call really the X factor in Iraq, using ISIS's power to attack Maliki. And I say partially so because it's Saudi Arabia that's actually indirectly using ISIS's power to attack Maliki. So why give up the bargaining hand today? They would, on one condition: a new prime minister in Baghdad and the Sunnis back the government in Baghdad. Is it in Saudi Arabia's immediate, we're talking really immediate interest, to cooperate with Iran to defeat ISIS? Maybe. But with ISIS defeated, Riyadh really has no cards to play in Iraq, like I said before. Riyadh has done some pretty dumb things over the past few years. But one thing it won't do is shoot itself in the foot in Iraq. I promise you that. If Saudi Arabia wants ISIS defeated, all it has to do is ask the Sunni tribes to finish it off. There's no need to go to Tehran. It's that simple. There's much more than ISIS happening in Iraq today. There's the former Ba'athis, there's the Sunni tribes, and all of those are at the forefront of what we all know is now a Sunni rebellion. ISIS happens to be at the forefront of it. They happen to be the most brutal force. But some pretty important facts I want everybody to remember. Mosul is controlled 80% by the Sunni tribes, only 20% by ISIS. I welcome the ambassador who challenged that fact. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was making a speech in that mosque, it was pretty much empty. What if ISIS becomes much stronger and really gets closer to the kingdom? After all, it's a few dozen miles away from Arar, which is a small town near the Saudi border. My point is that Saudi Arabia's concern is not ISIS per se. It is what Sunni militancy and radicalization as a whole, as a phenomenon, could cause inside the kingdom. It's kind of a ticking time bomb. The further it survives, the longer it survives, the more difficult it is to deal with its consequences. Here's my conclusion. In Iraq, there's a balance of terror today between the Iranians and the Saudis. And the only thing that can break it is compromise.
Thanks, Bilal. But I do want to press you on one point. How concerned should we be that as one of ISIS's or ISIL's many next steps would be some sort of threat to some territory or assets in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? How concerned are the Saudis about that as well? You sort of give the impression, not very, that they're looking towards other things, but I have to say most experts were surprised by ISIS's gains in Iraq this year, and it might be useful to inform policymaking to get ahead of their next surprise. Is this one of them, or should we not be concerned about that?
ISIS's gains in Iraq have been explained by a number of analysts, and a lot of it has to do with the relative weakness of the Iraqi army and the extent to which they received a lot of support from the Sunni tribes. So it's not exactly what ISIS was able to do, but it was a reflection of the weakness of the other side. I think that the countries that should be most immediately concerned about territorial gains of ISIS should be Jordan and Lebanon, not exactly Saudi Arabia. The very nature of ISIS explains pretty much why, like I said, Saudi Arabia shouldn't be that concerned about what ISIS could do. To me, the X factor, like I said before, is the former Ba'athis who have been the masterminds of this kind of phenomenon, and specifically a man by the name of Azzat al-Duri, and the Sunni tribes who have pretty much provided a fertile ground for this organization and this group to operate in Iraq. I think that the Saudis have some influence over some tribes. I don't want to say all of them. But that kind of leverage, that kind of influence reassures some in the kingdom that this is a manageable threat for now. And I'd like to be surprised otherwise.
Thanks very much. We're going to open it up to questions now. I might ask the ambassador the first question, but then please get your thoughts ready, and I'll call on you. And we'll bring microphones to you when they're ready. But Mr. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on what was said? And I had a question too.
Sure.
For you, sir. How can the U.S. avoid, I think what was characterized in the press, I think it might have been a comment by General Petraeus, how can the U.S. avoid being the Air Force for the Shia sect against the Sunnis and against ISIS in Iraq? How can we avoid that important sort of geometric political issue while still achieving some of our common interests?
I mean, with the election we just had, last week a speaker was elected who's a Jaburi, who's a Sunni from the Diyala province. All the other positions which we've been talking about, such as the various ministries, such as defense ministries or other important interior ministries and others, may go to Sunni Arab. So there are checks and balances which the political class in Iraq are discussing moving forward. So in a way, you will have key positions within the system who can make sure that this is not a single Shia narrative or others. That's on the structure aspect of it. On the other aspect of it is, which in a way complements what Bilal was talking about, is what you have now is surely not a Sunni Shi'i narrative per se. It's part of it, it's not the whole story. The situation, the atrocities which is committed by ISIL against the Sunni imams, executing 12 Sunni imams in one day in Mosul because they didn't hand over their mosque to them, is a sign. Blowing up mosques, literally, blowing up mosques is not a sign of a Shia Sunni narrative. It's much more dangerous. I'm a movie fan, and what we have now is a mutation. You know, the X-Man sort of thing. A mutation of the Al-Qaeda and the various elements, a mutation of the Ba'athist and the various elements, coming into a Frankenstein monster situation. It's beyond recognition. It cannot be controlled, unfortunately. It's not a switch-on, switch-off situation. The Cold War mentality of Iran and Saudi Arabia being used in Iraq will not work for either parties. To the Iranian, the strategic interest is a threat, border, literally, and in relation to Shiism. To the Saudis, I'm afraid they are not immune. The Jordanians are also not immune. The Lebanese might slightly differ in a sense. We Iraqis and Lebanese have become thick skins with these situations. We've had already areas addressed, and we've got used to this culture of violence, unfortunately. But to the Saudis, if what you're saying is right, then they're playing a risky game. I don't think this is advisable for anybody to play fire with this situation. Nobody can control the monster, the Frankenstein monster. It's what I talked about. A new narrative, a new doctrine has to be created to deal with this. And I can assure you of one thing. It's not another only episode. It's a decade episode. Whomever dealing with this situation has to have a decade long-term mentality, a marathon mentality in mind to say we need to address this sectarian narrative. And going back to the Shia situation, I'm afraid the Shia will not be in a strong positions anyway to bargain with the current situations. So why you're so fearful against the high risk of inaction?
Thanks very much. And now we'll open it for questions. Yes, this lady in the second row. When the microphone comes, please identify yourself.
Thank you so much. It was a great talk so far. I'm Christina Wong from The Hill. I have a question for the ambassador. I was hoping you could provide some clarity on something. The U.S. says that there is a delivery of Apaches for Iraq ready to go, and Iraq needs to sign the letter of acceptance and receipt and issue payment. And they say the ball is in Iraq's court. And I want to know, from your perspective, is there any delay in doing so? What are those?
Okay, the whole issue regarding the F-16s and Apaches and others has become, unfortunately, a chapter we could have prevented by early resolving the Iraqi request for F-16s and Apaches. It was stuck in Congress. It was stuck with the White House, various roles. Unfortunately, that delay has already had an impact, an adverse impact on us. We have sought this request for a long time. Until recently, it was approved by the Congress. And unfortunately, even if it's approved now, even if we pay the bills now, the pilots are not in place and so on. So it will not address the immediate threat we've had. It also has created various questions for us back home. The questions I talked about regarding the U.S. commitment to Iraq, that's not my own opinion. I'm talking about back home. I'm only, as an ambassador, reflecting serious concern back home as to the U.S. commitment to the integrity and to the protection of democracy of Iraq. That Apaches and F-16 and others are all, unfortunately, anecdotes, examples, which has strengthened the argument back home that the whole U.S. institutions are not backing Iraqi democracy.
So even if this next delivery is ready, it still won't come in time?
The pilots are not there. The pilots are not there. The pilots
are not there. Next question? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rashad Abul Hassan. I'm with the Syrian National Coalition. As Ambassador Hoff pointed out, the moderate opposition in Syria has been fighting ISIS for a long time. Do you foresee this question is for Ambassador Faily, do you foresee the Iraqi government working with the Syrian opposition against ISIS in the future, because they've remained largely neutral in the Syrian revolution?
We have tried to keep away from the Syrian internal issues for a long time, to the dismay of a lot of people, because we knew this issue will not go overnight, it will not be resolved overnight. The situation is the Syrian regime strength are much more than people try to give them, sort of grant them. And therefore, we will try to keep away from any internal Syrian issues. As much, by the way, as we kept away from the Kurdish situation in Turkey, the Shia problem for example, in Bahrain, and others as well. We have intentionally said we don't want to get in our neighbors' internal affairs, and we'll keep away as far as we can.
Well, I'm not encouraging that, but in a day and age where borders are rather porous, and in particular the Syria-Iraqi border has been extremely porous, and I think in some ways has led to the breadth of the problem that we're facing today. We're discussing Syria, we're discussing Iraq, we're discussing Jordan and then Lebanon. I mean, I think the days when we could say that this is an only internal affair are long past. I mean, are there
But where
issues?
do we draw the line of getting involved? With whom do we side against whom? That's the key issues. There are international issues for us. It's not an ethical problem we have, by the way. It's not that beggars can't be choosers, in a sense, what you're saying. It's just that where do we draw the line in getting involvement in other issues? And let me add a point which Bilal talked about and others in our southern Gulf countries. Unfortunately, over the last 10 years, we have bent backward and everything else to accommodate all our neighbors in relation to issues. We know for a fact none of them are, all of them are fragile. We knew for a fact if we wanted to get involved in internal affairs of our neighbors, we would have really had an impact. We have the funds, we have the ideology, we've got all the issues we need, but we kept away from it. We hope that this is a key lesson for others, that they need to not meddle too much into the Iraqi issues and let Iraq as their own selves. We have democracy, we have transparency in all we have doing. So they should respect that.
Fred, I think you had a thought.
Just comment briefly on the Iraq-Syria dynamic. The United States has had, and I predict will continue to have, a very difficult request of the Iraqi government, of whatever government emerges in Iraq, and that is for Iraq to deny Iran's use of airspace and ground space to transfer weaponry to the Assad regime in Syria, and for Iraq to deny Iran the ability to raise militias in Iraq and transport young Iraqi men to Syria to fight on behalf of the Assad regime. I think we all understand in a sort of political science 101 sense why it's so difficult for Iraq to say yes to this. But I think any Iraqi government can expect that the United States will continue to press on this front.
Can I add a point
Please,
regarding Bilal?
Please.
I mean, Bilal raised a question, and he wasn't sure regarding the answer as to why Iranians are not involved in heavily as they want. To be honest, they have offered us all the help, literally, to replace America or other in relation to any security agreements and others, when we said no. They have offered us in relation to militia and others, and we've said no. And we also had the same situation in Syria. We've tried to keep away our young ones from going to Syria situation. So in a way, we have consciously said no to the Iranians because we have big questions as to our relationship with the United States. We have a strategic framework agreement with the United States. Our military, our army, and everything else has been partnered with the United States. Why would we need to go to the Iranian? Why would we need to break international sanctions? And so on. So in a sense, we were trying to play the mature player in understanding the risk, but as I said in my speech, vacuum is being created and it will be filled by whomever is available on the ground. That's the reality of it.
Thanks very much. Additional questions? Yes, this gentleman in the second row.
Ibrahim Salah from American Kurdish Center. I was listening to all. I think the Kurdish issue completely ignored. And in the wake of the advance of ISIS, the Kurds are sharing the long border, 1,100 kilometers, more than 600 miles with the territory of the ISIS. And if it was not for the Kurdish soldiers, the Peshmerga, they could have spanned the Kurdish area to KRG, the most safest and secure area in Iraq for all these years. So the Kurdish soldiers hold it. And when the Kurdish soldiers went to save Kirkuk, the oil-rich area, it was basically a condemnation from the Iraqi central government that they are against the law, the constitution. But whether they left again for the terrorists to take over or the oil-rich areas, and now look at beside that there is.
What, do you have a question, sir?
Mike, I'm going to one more question.
Please.
More than 750,000 refugees is in Kurdish area, a small area, and the Kurdish people, without budget, for 7 months from central government. Iraq is a rich country, $150 billion a year. That they don't have the budget, they don't have no salary for 7 months, and they have a mass of refugees in Kurdistan. Isn't that, I ask you, Barry, and ask Michael, isn't that for the United States to ask the Iraqi government immediately to release the budget of Kurdistan to survive? And tomorrow, the whole burden will be on Kurdish area. And immediately bordering the ISIS, we will be in trouble. And we are the best of one of the best allies of United States. United States should strengthen the Kurdish KRG, should let us have weapons to defend ourselves.
What's your question?
The question to you, I'm asking that, could you ask our government, United States, to immediately ask the central government to raise the budget of the Kurdish area for the last 7 months, have no salary for the Kurdish people?
Do you have a response?
Yeah.
Thanks.
I think the key issue is the relationship between Baghdad and the KRG, which was prior to this unfortunate situation we're in now. That is going to be part of the ongoing government formation, clearing the various cold cases or hot cases would be one of the issues which will be dealt with. It will not be done in isolation. It will not be done as a transactional situation. No, it will be a package to understand exactly what's the roles and responsibility of KRG and central government. The KRG have taken more refugees than anybody else. They had already 250,000 Syrian refugees, Kurdish Syrian refugees. Now they have an extra maybe 500,000. They have done great jobs. What do you call it? Red Cross and Red Crescent and others are working with them. We have issues to address, humanitarian issues across. It's a serious issue. The displacement is a serious issue for us to address.
Thanks very much. Additional questions? Yes.
David Ignatius, I'd like to ask Ambassador Faily and anyone else who'd like to comment. Ambassador, do you still consider Iraq an Arab country? And if the answer is yes, can you imagine any situation in which the Arab League, of which Iraq is still a member, could play a useful role in this crisis? We all remember how the worst years of fighting in the Lebanese civil war were stabilized by the establishment of what was called an Arab deterrent force, largely Syrian, many negatives, but it did reduce the level of violence. Do you think there's anything in that kind of extra Iraqi intervention that would have legitimacy in the region that would be useful for you?
Thank you. I'm asking a Kurd about whether Iraq is part of the Arab nation. This is a bit of a tough question. I'm a Kurd myself. But I think we are a founding member of the Arab League. We strongly want to keep that. None of our officials, whether it was our Kurdish president or our Kurdish foreign minister, ever kept away or shied away from the Arabism part of Iraq, and they have been I would say even diehard members of the Arab League. Our foreign minister himself has had tremendous issues with our Arab government Prime Minister and others about how much they have. He has always pushed for Iraq to become more engaged in the Arab League. So in a way, I don't think there is an Arab internal within Iraq, an Arab, non-Arab situation as to our belonging to the Arab League. As to how effective they have, I'm afraid that's a good question. We have felt that the Arab League collectively have played positive role in strengthening the democracy of Iraq, but individual countries have somewhat been picky and choosy as to when do they want to deal with support the democracy of Iraq. That's an issue. I think it's a soul-searching question which the Arab have to address as much as they have. For example, people have said why their position in Libya was different than their positions elsewhere, and that's a good question. We are seeking support. We have, in various conferences, we've said you need to stand by with the democracy, with the integrity of Iraq, because we know for a fact the new ISIL mutation will not be confined to the borders of Iraq. And unfortunately, as I said, no one is immune from it. Let me just add one small point which might be useful to the debate in DC. What you have now in Iraq is not an issue of 10 years American engagement in Iraq. That Iraqi fatigueness may still stay, may prolong for a while. What you have now is an immediate threat to the whole region. It needs to be looked at in a fresh view, objectively, so that people are not blurred up as to the vision of how they see the situation. It's not a pure internal Iraqi issue. There are internal factors. Nobody's denying that, and we're reviewing that. But there are more regional and geopolitical implications, primarily, especially when you have a situation next to the Mediterranean and next to Europe. That's what the view needs to be looked at.
Michael.
I want to just say in support of this, I think that it's hard to imagine right now, I think, a sort of regional response to what's happening in Iraq because of the fragmentation we see in the region. I do think that one of the stories of the past few years has been that, especially with the Arab uprisings, Arab Spring in 2011, you saw the previous sort of regional security architecture in the Middle East really collapse. And at the center of that security architecture was the United States, but connected to it were some strong U.S. allies who, people like Hosni Mubarak and others who then were no longer there because of the revolutions that gripped the region. And what we have seen with especially the sort of stepping back of the United States is that a vacuum has been created into which there really is no one else who can step. There's no other external power who can step into that vacuum. And I think there is no sort of regional power or regional coalition that has proven capable of stepping into that vacuum. And so I do think that for the foreseeable future, it's going to need to be the United States to sort of fill that vacuum. And I don't think that there's a purely regional substitute for that. I do think the United States, and what we see in Iraq is an example of it, but certainly not the only one. The United States needs a new regional strategy, and security has to, I think, be at the center of that strategy. And our new role may not be precisely the same as our old role, but it still has to, I think, be the central role. We have allies in the region who I think can contribute if we provide that leadership. But I do think that one of our long-term objectives needs to be something which we didn't pay enough attention to in the past, and that is more regional integration, not just on the security side, but especially on the economic side. Compare the sort of regional economic activity in the Middle East to what it is in, say, Asia, where you also have plenty of other things going on. But you have a tremendous amount of intra-regional economic activity in Asia, which is just utterly lacking, for example, in the Middle East. And so as we think about what's the new American strategy in the Middle East, I think that we're going to need to play that central security role, but there need to be other sort of regional integration elements built around it.
Very good. Bilal?
The Arab League today, what is it? It's, whether we like it or not, it's primarily Saudi Arabia. It used to be Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt's out of the picture. The circumstances under which an Arab deterrent force would materialize would happen under the framework, something you mentioned in one of your columns, David, is an Iranian-Saudi summit. The deterrent force will be a byproduct of that. Now that begs the question, will we ever witness a Saudi-Iranian summit? I've been arguing for that for some time, but I think that the leaderships in Riyadh and Tehran are just not ready for that. It's unfortunate, but in my opinion, the one thing that will save Iraq and prevent its partition de jure at least, even though it's happening de facto, is an understanding and a compromise between the Saudis and the Iranians. And I'm not saying that there should be reconciling. I'm not naive to the depth of the differences between the two countries. But a pragmatic, realist management of the relationship, a stabilization of the relationship, making sure that certain red lines are not crossed that happened throughout the Cold War between the Americans and the Soviets. This is exactly what the Saudis and the Iranians need today to extinguish many of the fires that are happening across the region. Unfortunately, both leaderships are not ready for that yet. Something much worse needs to happen for them to realize that this is the time to talk much more seriously.
So very quickly, what about the GCC? What if this gets much worse? What if it spills over? Is there any sense in terms of a regional approach of the GCC, perhaps led by the United States, playing some role if this gets worse?
I'm always very cautious to talk about a GCC as a whole. And you know that for some time now, I've been arguing that the differences within that group have been pretty significant as well. If I call the Arab League Saudi Arabia today, I will call the GCC Saudi Arabia as well. There's some people who want nothing to do with the GCC within that same group. Therefore, any cohesive and collective response coming from the GCC, for me, is kind of a myth. Therefore, it's going to be individual approaches from certain countries. And given the relative weight of Saudi Arabia, it's going to be Saudi Arabia that's going to be speaking the loudest, and it's going to have the most influence over what that part of the world, the Arab Gulf, will do, whether in Iraq or in other places in the Middle East. So GCC as a whole is kind of a tough analytical concept for me to understand, frankly.
I'm really sorry that we're out of time. I wish we could go on quite a bit longer because I know I alone had another dozen questions, but and I'm sure you did. But please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists today.